Thought Leaders series. Most of you know about SVP India, but just give me the liberty of 30 seconds. SVP International, of course, is over 20 years old now, and we have close to 3,600 partners, 12 countries, and expand all the way. I mean, it's largely the US, but also Asia. We have Japan, of course. We have joining from Australia, Kenji from Japan. So we have other countries as well. And overall, I think the goal has been to have partners collaborating, providing time, expertise, and money for various causes. And each of us have chosen causes that we would like to support. In India, when we started 5 years ago, the cause was what was appropriate then and what is even more appropriate today, which is the whole livelihoods issue. So we said we will all focus on sustainable livelihoods. And today we have 7 very vibrant chapters with over 300 partners who are working together and working with over 40 not-for-profits to further that cause. We've been privileged to have a partnership with the Tata Trusts to create what is called the Million Jobs Mission. And the premise of the Million Jobs Mission has been that we should try and ensure that as much as possible, we support our NGOs to make that happen. If you look across our network, you'll find that over 250,000 sustainable livelihoods have been created. And going forward, we'd like to see a lot more of that happening, of course. So when the lockdown started, we said that, look, it's going to be difficult to meet physically. And we said it's important for us to keep engaged. And hence, we thought of the Thought Leader series. The very first edition was about 4 weeks ago when we had Sophia, who's our global chair. Sophia also runs the Giving Pledge of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So Sophia and Arun Maira, who I think for the Indian audience, Arun has been one of our thought leaders of the Planning Commission and working closely with some of us on a systems model for change, which is what was presented. We then had some outstanding corporate social responsibility heads led by our Bombay chair, Mita, talked about what they are looking at in terms of ensuring that the not-profit sector really becomes more resilient going forward. Then it was a turn of the non-profits, and we had 3 of our most outstanding non-profits presenting and discussing what they have done during the phase of COVID and what they intend to do in the future. So it's been absolutely amazing. This is the 4th in the series, where we thought it's extremely important to say, what does leadership really mean at the times of crisis? I mean, we can all argue whether this is a big crisis or a small crisis, but crisis it is. And I think this is something that we all recognize. So we have 3 outstanding leaders, Ajit Rangnekar, whom I think many of you know, and I'll introduce shortly. Mark Jankelson, who's also the chair of SVP Melbourne in Australia. And of course, Meher Padamji, who has been part of our board, was till recently the chair of SVP Pune. And we thought we will discuss with them what are the opportunities, the challenges, and what they would like to do. So very quickly, to introduce the participants. Ajit, of course, as all of us know him as the former dean of the Indian School of Business, which is one of the most successful business schools in the country today. Currently the Director General of the Research and Innovation Circle of Telangana, which is one of our southern states. Alumnus of the top schools in India, IIT Bombay and IIM Ahmedabad. Ajit also headed the PricewaterhouseCoopers business in Hong Kong and Philippines and has a very impressive career spanning over 30 years. Ajit has been with Social Venture Partners for more than 3 years and has been the very, very successful chair of the Hyderabad chapter since its inception. Ajit also has a liking for cricket and tennis and reading. And of course, he scolds us all when some things go wrong. So we are very careful that we dot our I's and cross our T's with Ajit. And Ajit, of course, believes doing what is right, irrespective of the cost and consequences. Moving quickly to Mark. Mark is a colleague of mine on the board of SVP International, and he's been an outstanding friend and partner for the last few years. He has a special interest in mentoring and coaching leaders, advising organizations on ethical leadership issues, and helping organizations transform their cultures. Mark is currently engaged in a portfolio of activities, including running the Bondiru Walnut Company, which is a very successful commercial walnut business with orchards in central Victoria, southern New South Wales, with his wife, Hilary. He's also a board chair and partner investor in Social Venture Partners in Melbourne, and a board member, as I mentioned earlier, of Social Venture Partners International. He also runs his own consulting, coaching, and mentoring practice. And finally, Meher Padamji. We all know her as chairperson of the Thermax Group, which is one of the most successful corporates in this country. Meher has been an active philanthropist, and so has her mother, Anu Aga been. And I know both of them for a very long time in terms of the real value addition they do in philanthropy. A real passion for making a difference, particularly in education. Her heart ticks for children. She's a management council member of SVP and has been the chapter chair in Pune till very recently. The chairperson of Akanksha Foundation, a trustee of Teach Lead in Mumbai. While being a very successful corporate leader, Meher has always held ethics and culture very close to her heart. Also has a very keen interest in Western classical music and loves to not miss her choir sessions. I certainly don't miss her because she's a fantastic singer, apart from being a great leader. So now I will get out of the way. The way we'll run this session is, I'll leave it to Ajit. Ajit has a set of points, questions. We will have a couple of polls in between. So make sure you're not napping and answer the polls, because we'll check whether you're answering the poll or not. And of course, once we're done with the initial interactions, we will certainly have opportunities to answer any questions you have. The chat line is open. Feel free as a thought strikes you to post the chat. We'll also see if towards the end we can have time for physical Q&A, but please do use the chat line. So thank you very much. And without further ado, over to you, Ajit.
Thank you, Ganesh. Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Good. So great. Good morning, everybody. Wonderful to be a part of this session. This one, we are not going to have monologues from any of the speakers. We are going to have, it's going to be interactive. There'll be questions, answers, discussions. Feel free to add your questions to the chat group. As Ganesh also mentioned, we are going to have 3 survey questions to really see what you feel and not just what we feel, right? So let me get started. When Ganesh asked me to moderate this session, honestly, I was a little taken aback, but I thought it would be good for us to break it into 3 components. First is, what do we ourselves, each of us, believe? Because what we believe translates into how we lead, whether it's organizations or whatever. So we'll first spend some time on personal beliefs, what we think as human beings, as people, then move on to our role as corporate leaders, and then discuss issues of NGO leadership. So let me start personally myself, and what I'm going through. So this has been a very, very, different experience to anything I've had all these years. And the first thing that hit me was that all the assumptions on which we believed and worked every day have turned out to be questionable. Our growth models, our so-called feeling that we have created globally, a huge global economic system which turned out to be so fragile that it could collapse at the slightest, well, it's not the slightest, but certainly at the first big push that it got, right? Issues of transient labors, etc., etc. So, I think one steps back and says, is our model of growth correct? Should we be doing something completely different from what we've been doing? And I think that's one thing which has been certainly bothering me. The second thing that's bothering me, and when you look at my hair or lack of hair, you'll understand why, is the moral dilemma that the world is going through. In Italy, for example, we saw that, when it came to making ventilators available, for whom should they be available? For the young or the not so young? And whose life is more valuable to the society? On a similar scale, there is this continuing question of life versus livelihood. Whose lives are we trying to save? And whose large livelihood should we save instead? So there are these whole issues of moral dilemma. There is, of course, the third one of growth versus environment, right? But so these have come up again to the fore, and one needs to be very clear about it. The third one was fascinating. All these years, I thought that, you put any question to me and I've been there, done that, no problem. And for the first time, I'm faced with something where I have not been there and I haven't done it. And oops, I don't know what the hell to do with it. So we are looking at new tools, new models, and Ganesh already referred to Arun Maira's systems approach. So how do we now relook at our toolkit of solving problems, and how do we re-equip ourselves to solve these big problems. And the last one, of course, is something which again has struck me very strongly, is that this time when all of us are feeling the greatest amount of financial pain ourselves, this is the time for us to give the maximum. Now is when we must give much more than we have ever given before. So these have been some of these, if I can say, ways in which things have changed in the way I have looked at things. But I'll stop here. I don't want to, as I said, go on a monologue. Let me switch to Meher. Meher, you've grown up with philanthropy, you've grown up with industry, you've seen so many things. How has this experience, has it changed your perceptions? Has it changed the way you look at things?
Thanks, Ajit. Thanks, Ganesh, Ajit, and Mrinal for inviting me here for the 4th leadership series. Ajit, to your question, I feel that there is just so much more to do. To the fore, and I really want to say that, I mean, for me, okay, philanthropy, we're writing checks, we're giving a little bit of our time, we're giving a little bit of our gyan. But honestly and truly, I want to take this opportunity to thank those frontline people who have risked their lives. Whether it's the doctors, the frontline workers, the people who come here to do our jharu in the societies, just everyone who's rallying around, all the NGOs, the way they've rallied around. I mean, I feel guilty almost sitting at home at this point in time. Anu and I were discussing, I wish we could sort of jump in there and be of help. But I guess that's not to be. But we've really, as you mentioned, we've been in education predominantly. But COVID has brought out the pathetic health system in our country, the hospitals, the sanitation, which was always pretty bad. The fact that there's so much child abuse that's going on right now, sexual abuse that's going on in the communities, because people are just put into a tiny little area. We keep talking about social distancing, but I mean, what the hell is social distancing in a slum? Honestly, I never knew how deep the problem was about migrant workers and the daily wage earners till COVID. So suddenly I'm reading a lot more. I'm attending webinars to try and understand the gravity of the situation. I mean, these people have come from Bihar, from Jharkhand to places like Maharashtra to find some work. And it's really pathetic, and I didn't know this, that the ration card that they have in Bihar, they cannot use in Maharashtra. I mean, we call ourselves one country, one India. How is it possible that a ration card cannot be used anywhere in this country? I was reading somewhere that in Bombay, for these daily wage earners, they have to pay 20 rupees to have a bath. They have to pay 5 rupees to use the toilet. I mean, even in the best of times, I think it's a very unfair, inequitable society. But today, I really don't know how these people survive. So I just feel that the issues are huge. And I also feel that philanthropy, just as we do in SVP, it's about money, it's about your time and commitment and lending your skill set, exactly like what all of us do at SVP. And it's just that all this while, I've just been trying to understand a little more of the problem, just sort of peeling the onion. And what we do is just a drop in the ocean. But I guess every drop helps.
Thank you. Thank you. And you're absolutely right. We are all rediscovering, well, actually discovering, not even rediscovering, the enormous scale of the problem that we have not really faced and the multifaceted nature of it all, and how do we deal with it. Very true, very true. Thank you, thank you. Let me turn to Mark. Mark, I was in Australia in December, and I thought that bushfires was perhaps the biggest thing that has hit the environment. And barely within a couple of months, you guys get hit with COVID. So you people have dealt with two major crises, one after another. What have you people learned from it? What has been you've been also a mentor to people, so you must have a much better idea of how different people also think.
Yeah, thanks. Firstly, let me thank Ganesh for hooking us from Australia into this dialogue. You know, when you sit in what is really a very privileged society, it's easy not to see where some of the mega problems are. But as I've listened in to a number of your sessions, I continue to confront my own personal privilege. And as you say, this feeling of needing to do more, but the magnitude of what you're dealing with is so more significant than what we see here. So thank you for exposing me to that. I grew up in South Africa, and the first crisis, if you like, which was a personal crisis, was do I stay and fight apartheid, or do I leave and go somewhere and forge a new life? And that was a big moral dilemma for me, and continued to be for a long while. But I did, in fact, leave and go to Australia and start a new life. But I have observed leaders for 40 years now. I've observed, I've coached, I've tried to educate leaders. And as you say, the bushfire crisis did bring into very sharp relief what leadership was being asked for and what leadership was being given. And I have to say, and this is pretty much agreed by most observers, that the leadership, and one can talk particularly about political leadership, was left a bit wanting. And it wasn't as cohesive and as impactful and as empathetic as one would expect. But the good thing is leaders do learn. And as we observe Australia's response to this crisis, the leaders have come up very, very differently, and have in fact shown one thing that in all of the literature that's talked about in managing crises has come to the fore, and that is the capacity for empathy and putting people first. And that resonates very strongly with my own personal approach to and my personal values about leadership. The other thing that strikes me is something that I refer to as bounded optimism, and I saw this recently in a McKinsey article, and I really like the idea of bounded optimism. And in fact, Martin Seligman, who wrote a lot about optimism, said that optimism can be learned. And I think that leaders, and I'm seeing this in the best leaders, are providing a good balance of realism, if you like, and optimism, so that giving people hope that things will turn out okay.
Yeah, good, yes, it is right, you know, and especially when you see two big crises, one after the other. How do you balance that realism with you know, optimism? And if you, I think that's a great segue into, you know, corporate leadership. Both of you are corporate leaders, advisors in your case, etc. So how are you? Right now, we are deep in the crisis, right? It's not as if we have got over it and now we are reflecting. We are bang in the middle of it. So how are you dealing with this right now? And let me start with Meher, because in her case, it's more fascinating. I mean, she has recently appointed a new CEO. Talk of baptism by fire. so as a non-executive chair, how do you ensure that your company is doing the right things?
Yeah, absolute baptism by fire. I agree. But let me say that we have a new CEO. He's actually located in Delhi. Not that that makes a difference at the moment. But the difference being that, of course, he can't physically meet people. And luckily, we also have Unni, who is retiring in August. So he's helping to mentor him, to help him through. And what is wonderful, and I thank technology for it, is that he's been able to talk to each senior person in the organization one-on-one, really trying to get to know them. What are their challenges? What do they believe? And I think that's really helped in terms of him getting to know Thermax, getting to know the organization. He did a very lovely thing. He sent out an email to all our employees when he joined saying, what does it mean to be Thermax? And he got hundreds of responses from just across the board, from the youngest to somebody who's been with the organization for years. And each of them spoke about what does it mean to them to be Thermax. And remember that this has happened during the crisis. So a number of things came out in terms of values, in terms of our culture, in terms of certain opportunities that we should be taking and haven't taken up to now. So just a whole load of things. But just coming back to some of the things that we decided amongst us, number one will be people and the safety of our people. So we've done a huge amount and put in, of course, we are now opening our offices, our factories. And so we put in a huge amount of effort in terms of our SOPs, which is our standard operating procedures, and how people will need to, behave as they come into the organization, how they will have to make a declaration, and we call it a self-declaration, but it's really a declaration on behalf of the whole family that you're living with, because you're only as safe as all of us are safe, when we're living with. So how do we really help them to make an honest declaration? Allow them to stay at home. If it's that your pay is not going to be cut if you stay at home and make a declaration that somebody is sick in your family. So talking about those things. So first is people. The second is cash. It's a very difficult time. And so how do we really look at keeping the cash that is in the system? Luckily, we have a healthy balance sheet as of now, but it's taken years to build and can evaporate over time. And so how do we really build a robust system? And for that, we've got many teams in terms of how do we reduce costs. We've got teams in terms of how do we come up with innovative ideas. So different things that have been laid out in the organization. And the third, which I think is really, really important at this point in time, is communication. So we have something called an open forum, which was started by Anu many years ago. And we said, how are we going to do this forum with, remotely? And again, thanks to technology, and we have teams, we were able to do it with 3,500 people. Wow. We asked them to send their questions in advance. And when I talk about communication, I mean honest, transparent, authentic communication. I think it's okay sometimes to even share your dilemmas, and let people are not stupid. People are listening, people are reading, people know how difficult it is out there. So we've had 3 such open forums. In fact, one of them we had with our women, and which was just good fun. And Anu and I conducted that. So it was just a fun type of thing. And it's important to have that fun bit at this time as well. Everything can't be too serious, I guess. It's what Mark mentioned in terms of that optimism. We have to bring that optimism, but realism as well. So I think maybe I can talk a little bit about some of the dilemmas that we have as a core team spoken about. One of them is, should we ask people to go? Or should we be cutting salaries? And I have to say that all of us discussed it, we deliberated for a long time. I mean, probably the whole of April. And decided that at this point in time, it would be really unfair to let anybody leave the organization. But let me also say it's a dynamic situation. And so we would have to, obviously, if things get worse, one would have to take other decisions. But as of today, we have taken a decision that we will have certain salary cuts at different grades within the company. And some of them in the white collar will have no cuts at all below a certain salary figure. The second dilemma that we had was, should we continue to invest in R&D? In some of the projects that we've been working on for some of them for years together. And we took a decision that we will continue to invest in that. But the only caveat is we will have certain milestones. And again, if things get very bad and out of hand, there's so much uncertainty at the moment. So if things really get out of hand, we'll come back to it. So we'll come back to everything every few weeks just to see, are we on the right path? So thank you.
Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Just what I expected from you, Mahesh. This is a plug for my student, of course. But no, so now you are giving me a dilemma, whether to continue and have this discussion or to flip between Mark and you. And I am going to actually flip between the two of you at the risk of losing the thread, but I'll pull back the thread. But I think some phenomenal points that came out of it. And, very often when we all talk about values of an organization, we keep thinking top down. What you have done is you have allowed it to bubble up from the bottom up, where the youngest employee is telling the newest boss, hey, these are my values. That's, I think, an outstanding way of letting somebody new at the senior level really and genuinely understand what the values of an organization are. If I was joining something and a 3-month-old young engineer or an assistant told me these are the values, the fact that they're thinking about the values and the fact that they know what the values are, great, absolutely great. There are so many other things which we will come back to a little later. But let me flip out, because I think this is a great opportunity also for us to continuously contrast, what's happening outside. Sometimes we get all caught up in our own Indian challenges world, etc. And it's good to get a different perspective. Okay. And for the audience as a whole, I don't think we are looking for prescriptive answers here. What we are looking for is the view of two different people in different ways. And I urge each one of you as leaders to introspect and think about what it means for you. So let me get to you. So Mark, how are you fighting this fire right now? I'm sorry, with bushfires, maybe I should have used a different term.
Well, I think a lot of what I'm going to say is observation, because largely I'm sitting in my property in the farm, managing my own enterprise with its difficulties, but with a very small number of staff. But let me reference a couple of things which I think are pretty interesting. One of them is the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. she displays a number of the things that Meher was talking about. At some point, I can send a reference to a very interesting analysis of her leadership style, which was titled A Masterclass in Crisis Leadership. Yes. So everybody has a copy of it. One of the things that struck me was her ability to do what was referenced as meaning making. So to be able to put to the people, here are the issues, quite transparently, and then communicate in a very personal way, just like Meher was describing, using Facebook and a daily video call from her home in her casual clothes after she'd put her children to bed. And it kind of displayed her capacity for empathy and her ability to communicate in a way that I think was very, very credible. So, you know, to me, that is a very good example of crisis leadership at its best. The other thing I wanted to reference, and just to pick up on what Meher has said, it's very clear, if ever it was true, that top-down leadership doesn't work. That right now, the best thing that leaders can do is confirm mission and purpose, and then empower lots of people to come up with the ideas and the solutions, and to be listening and responding in a way that makes people feel that they have a part to play. I'm reminded by quite a famous quote from Donald Rumsfeld, who said that that there are known knowns, there are known unknowns, and then there are things that the unknown unknowns, the things that we don't know, we don't know. And I think it was never more true right now that that is the case. So for leaders to have the capacity to think the unthinkable, I think is really, really important. And that capacity doesn't rest just at the top. I want to reference Arun's description of the systems model at our, not the last session, the one before, because I asked him a question about leadership then. And I think it's a good example of how you can arm people with a framework and then empower them to go out and explore and use the framework in a way that unleashes the capacity of people to do the best that they can do. So, you know, I think all of that tells us as you said right in the beginning, we don't have the answers. We can't possibly have the answers. But what we do need to see from our leaders, and I think the very best at doing this, is planning for the unthinkable, the possibility that collaborations with your competitors might be a way of the future. So there are so many possibilities that this crisis has thrown up, that the best leaders are going to be attuned to that and take advantage of it.
Thank you. Great. Because that now gets me back to the next two sets of questions, both of which, and by the way, for the audience, you know, we hadn't really practiced this. It's just that it's flowing through so beautifully that I'm delighted, absolutely. And, you know, so one of the things, again, Mark, which Arun had mentioned, was everybody sitting together. And, you know, in that systems model, today what's happening is each one of us is going and making demands for our own interests, right? So there is a farmer lobby, there is a small manufacturers lobby, large manufacturers lobby, consumers lobby. There is even a bunch of lawyers who say we are out of job and therefore we need sustenance. But we'll leave that aside. So how do we all work together, right? But, and I think, you know, if time permits, we'll come back to that. But I think there were two other more interesting things that both of you mentioned in different ways. Meher talked about the frontline workers and how they had risen to the occasion. Also how young people in her company were doing things on their own, right? So there is what is it, small L leadership, right, versus the large L leadership. Now, as companies, as people, how do we, this is great that a whole lot of initiative, enthusiasm, willingness to do things is all bubbling up from within. But should we just allow it to go? Should we harness it? What is our role as senior leaders? Let me start with you, Mark, and then I'll go to Meher on that.
Mute. I think it's up to leaders to articulate a framework. And as I said earlier, to confirm the purpose of the organization or redefine it if the purpose has changed. The example is given of Airbnb that have had to quite significantly redefine their purpose in the current environment. So the senior leadership does need to do that and then provide the framework where the ideas can then be picked up by others. To me, that is the way, arguably the way it should have always worked. But this has really, really highlighted the need for much more distributed leadership in so many different areas.
Right. Meher, do you have a view, or I have a whole lot of other questions for you too?
Well, a little bit in terms of, first of all, I think that this amount of collaboration and innovation has been just phenomenal. I mean, look at the way the scientific community have come together, where they're looking to see how to come up with a vaccine really quickly for the world. I just feel, I'll maybe say a few things that we have done. So one of the things that we've done, we've only got 2 people in our Thermax Foundation. And so everything is done through NGOs. And NGOs are the people who really have their eyes, ears, feet on the ground. And so whether it be food grains, whether it be food, all that was done through NGOs. And NGOs many of them used the police force, because the police force knew who were the people who were the most needy. And so again, there was a lot of collaboration out there. And then look at the way Give India collaborated with musicians in order to collect
celebrities, everyone. Yes, absolutely.
Great effort. In our own company, what we've done is we've created something called an Innovate portal. And so we've just let it out there and said that anyone who comes up with a good idea, if they see an opportunity, which many of them see, which we don't, put it onto that portal. And I personally, along with, of course, somebody who's been identified to go through it, I personally go through each of these ideas to see what is it that we can really do, because some of them have come up with really good ideas. And so how can we take it forward? How can we perhaps even include that person, into help solving the problem? Because it's one thing to put up an idea, but another thing to actually make it into action. We've also collaborated, or we're trying to collaborate with a small startup. In fact, thanks to Jogin and SVP, I was connected and my flight was delayed in Bangalore when I was there in January. So Mrunal and I went to CCamp. So, yes. And so we're collaborating with one of the startups over there to try and see whether we can come up with something called a respirator. It's going through trials right now. And fingers crossed that something does come out of it. So I think there's just a whole bunch of innovation, collaboration out there, which is really heartening.
And would that extend to competitors? Would that extend to vertical? It's happening in the life sciences, right? They are all competitors, vaccine companies, but they are.
Yeah. Unfortunately, a couple of our competitors, and we've got their briefs from investment bankers. Would we want to take them on? I wouldn't call that collaboration. But right now, no, we're not looking at that. But I mean, we're always open to keeping our eyes and ears open to see if there are opportunities in future. But nothing at the moment.
So let me get to the other thing. With both Mark and you alluded in different ways. None of us know what the future holds. Correct? Yes, we are talking about optimism. Yet we are talking about honest, authentic communication. Yes, but there must be a preparation for a worst case scenario. Correct? Given the level of uncertainty, so question is, A, are you at all preparing for or at least planning, not preparing really, planning for a worst case scenario, and how do you do it without demoralizing your troops? How do you do it? Where does authentic communication end? Where does preparation? Because you don't want to be telling people, oh, and by the way, there is a 3% chance that, every world may come to an end and all of us. But, so how do you doing that really?
That's a great question. I think at some level in an organization, there's got to be some scenario planning, more so now than ever. That was kind of what I was referring to about preparing for the unthinkable. And I think it is important that leadership teams spend some time doing some what ifs. Because we hear about the possibilities of collaboration, but we see it, I have seen it in the non-profit sector, but I'm struggling to see good examples in the for-profit sector. So I think it's going to come, it's being forecast, certainly collaboration with adjacent businesses. So I think those scenarios need much more work. And I am aware of organizations that are engaging in post-COVID scenarios to try and forecast what are some of the possibilities. Then the question is, how much do you communicate? I'm not sure about that. I think there are risks in being too pessimistic about potential outcomes. I don't know. Maya, what's your thought?
Honestly and truly, we started with a budget, which we normally do. Our financial year starts in April. And so we normally have the budgets complete by January. And since then, we have gone back and forth 5 times. Each one obviously worse than the previous, as various things unfolded. And so right now we are at a stage where we have sort of a so-called realistic budget, and we have a so-called worst case budget. But I'm already seeing that the scenario is tipping more to the worst than the realistic. I do have a fear in terms of repeated lockdowns, which could well happen. I do have a fear. I think there's so many question marks. So, like, my grandfather used to say, my grandfather worked for Godrej, and he used to say that he compares a leader in crisis to a Godrej safe, where he said when fires are burning outside, the contents of the Godrej safe remain cool. That's how a leader needs to be, So I think we need to keep our cool, and there are certain guidelines that we have kept for the company. For example, we have said we will not make investments at this point in time, except in, as I mentioned, R&D, in anything to do with human safety, and some parts of digitization, which I think, in fact, we're trying to see how we can make various apps for this contact tracing and social distancing and all that. So I think things like that, yes. We've also said that we will not recruit right now, but obviously we will have to replace certain critical positions should we lose people. Then we've also said that, as I mentioned earlier, that we will have certain salary cuts, but at this present time, we will not let go of manpower. But, you know, we have gone through a very difficult time, Thermax did, in the year 2000, when my mom was chairperson. And so I can't help but say that I think the most important thing is communication, and authentic, honest communication. And I think she did a fabulous job of it at that time. I mean, to such an extent that, and I have to bring this up, it's where we actually made a profit on our P&L after we made a huge loss. A couple of years later, we made a profit, but the profit had come from our treasury operations and not from our own operations. And she went out there and told our shareholders that this is not what I expected. This is not Thermax. You have not put your hard-earned money into a company. If you wanted to invest in the stock market, you could have done it yourself. You didn't have to go through Thermax. And I think so. I think it's just this authentic way of saying what it is can go a long way. I think Ajit's frozen.
Is he? I was thinking as you were talking, where is the place where this sort of forward thinking about real possibilities that are beyond where you are today, where is that thinking taking place?
Mark, we are, you know, we've always, see, I'm a non-executive chairperson in that sense, and we have a complete board of independent directors. We've always sort of looked at the organization to come up with ideas. My dad was who built this organization, so I'm a third generation family business. But my dad who built it was my grandfather who built it. They were both not engineers, and yet they built an engineering company. And how would you do that? You can only do that by really sort of empowering and giving people responsibility. And so I think that has held us in good stead even today. Ideas can come from anywhere. It doesn't always have to come from the top. You know, so this Innovate portal hopefully will try and get some ideas in. Of course, we have to think ourselves as well, but I think it's really distributed across the organization.
Great. Can I interrupt you folks and request Mrinal to put up the first poll, please? And just put up the poll. We want you to make some quick answers and then we'll come back.
Yeah.
Mrinal, all yours.
Yes. Thank you, Ganesh. I'll just put it up right away and you'll have 30 seconds to answer it. Is it visible to everyone?
Move your mouse to the right place and click.
Yes, it's visible.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Just choose one and then click submit, please.
Okay. I can see that about 60% people have voted.
Good. Are you going to tell us the answer?
Yeah, if you want me to.
We'll hold it as a secret. Okay. Let me jump in and ask you a couple of questions, Mark. I think Meera, who's one of our brightest non-profits, so she's commenting on your point on unbounded optimism and saying that look, unbounded optimism is great. I mean, is there any scope for pessimism in these times? Any further thoughts on how we can actually be unbounded optimism when there are so many funny leaders and funny situations floating around?
Ganesh, if I said unbounded, I meant bounded optimism. So just to correct myself if I did say that, which really implies that, you know, you have to temper your optimism with a little bit of realism as well. Is there place for pessimism? I put that in the category of scenario planning. So, because I do think there is probably too much pessimism around. I think it's really important to confront the realities and to understand them and to maybe put probabilities on the likely outcome. But if we are so influenced by that, we will never make progress. So I see a bounded optimism as a balancing act, and the scenario planning is the place for confronting the downsides and what we will do to deal with them. That's kind of the way I think.
Yeah, that's very practical. May I have a question to you from
Ganesh,
who lives in Shanghai? Sorry,
Ganesh.
Ajit is back.
Yeah, Ajit, just give me a second. I'll just finish your question. So, may the question to you is from Renu, China. Saying there are, I mean, we're talking about dilemmas. You know, we all talked about personal dilemmas, etc. But at the same time, there are some strong leaders who very clearly show the way forward. So, is there an inherent contradiction being very dilemma and introspection oriented versus saying, "Let me show you the way"?
You know, I think as Mark talked about it in many ways. I think showing you the way when times are good, yes, you come there, you show the way, you move forward. But I think when we're in a crisis situation, I feel just the way Mark described Jacinda of New Zealand, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and the way in some ways she's showing that she's human as well. You know, that I'm human as well. I mean, I am facing dilemmas. I am facing question marks in my head. And I think the more, I don't think you should look at it as being, as failing or as being, you know, you're doubting ways forward. Right now, everybody's going through a situation where there are too many unknowns. And so I think the more you share it, and I'm not talking about sharing it with 3,500 people. I'm talking about sharing it in a group of senior management. The more you share it, the more you discuss it, the more we keep saying, is this in line with our culture? Is this in line with our values? I think it does make sense.
Okay, one more question before I hand back to Ajit. Like again to you, Meher. This is from Ram Kaundunia, our co-chair in Hyderabad. He's saying that is it possible that we'll just fall back into old ways after COVID?
You know, sometimes I feel memories are very short, and you know, this huge thing about we will not buy anything from China and stuff like that. Ultimately, honestly and truly, I believe that economics talks. And so yes, there will be various backlashes and things, but let me give you a few ways in which I think things might stay or things might change. Some of the areas I think are working from home. I mean, honestly, we tried it 2 years ago, or we wanted to try it 2 years ago, because we said, how do we increase the number of women in Thermax? And we thought one of the ways of doing it was letting people work from home, anybody, man or woman. And that way more women will probably come into the workforce. But we were immediately sort of said, no, engineering companies, you cannot work from home. And of course, look at all of us today. But of course, one has to look at productivity and all that. But having said that, I think it is here to stay. And let me talk about the economics part of it, which also people will look at once COVID goes away. You're saving on rentals, you're saving on transportation, you're saving on CO2 footprint. So in every which way, it's the economics that will probably play out. The second I feel is that probably, and I'm not so sure about it yet, I feel consumption patterns might change going forward. We've been so used to living with very little, and also people will be without jobs. There are so many who are already without jobs. And so therefore, consumption patterns might go through a structural change. And so, sorry. And so I feel that there is something over there that one needs to look at in terms of the demand. I think supply chains also will go through change. People are going to think through in terms of, have I got some concentration of suppliers in any one area, in any one country compared to others? So green and climate change is a huge thing. I mean, I don't have an answer for it at the moment, but a lot of climate change is dependent on subsidies from governments. Governments are bankrupt, are going to be bankrupt all over the place. And so where will those subsidies come? So again, economics, if green is to continue, I think companies are going to have to come out with products that are self-sufficient, you know, that give a payback.
Yeah.
If you talking about the change in consumption patterns, do you think that fashion will go out of fashion and you don't see yourself buying a Louis Vuitton face mask in the near future?
You're asking the wrong person.
I know. Back to you, Ajit.
Can I pick up on a couple of things just that Mayor has said, which
especially Louis Vuitton, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Just in reference to the working remotely, I think there's going to be a change in the shape of that, because at the moment it ignores the human need for social interaction. And while I absolutely agree that remote working will become a feature, I think there are going to be some other layers that organizations will have to put in to account for the need for social interaction and idea generation. So there could be hubs created where people do get together from time to time. I've heard of organizations rostering people to work from home for a period and then work in the office for a period to ensure that there's an exchange of ideas. So I think there's going to be some quite subtle changes that will take place to account for that human need for interaction.
I totally agree, Mark.
So yeah, so you know, this is something that we as consulting companies used to do even in the 20th century. So a good consulting company used to have 1/3 the seats. That means 1/3 of the number of people could only sit. The rest had to better be at client offices, and then how you brought them back and things like that. So, Mayor, I mean, you know, and this is a good, again, I know that Ram Kaundinya asked the question, and again, I didn't really prompt him or this thing. But just to take up further on that, you know, there is going to be a strong tendency to go back. That's something we know, we feel comfortable about, etc., right? And as you can see, the economic needs for new things is going to be a strong motivation. How are you going to manage that whole process? You know, how, there will be a whole lot of people say, no, now let's get back. Let's, you know, all that is over. So as leaders, what are some of the ways in which, I mean, for you, there already seem to be things in place. You already have a culture of people giving ideas. You already have a new innovative platform. So would you give people these questions, or would you allow it to come up? I'm just curious to know how you're thinking about planning for that future.
Ajit, I think, this work from home, we haven't really thought through it beyond the COVID, to be honest, but it's something that we are thinking about right now as we speak. So we haven't got the entire plan in place, but I completely agree with what Mark has said in terms of, and let me also say that for Thermax, unfortunately, a lot of our offices are owned. Unlike, you know, in India, we tend to buy thinking, you know, real estate is a good thing to have. And so a lot of our offices are owned. So we'll have to really think through in terms of how do we do this. And I'm talking about in the major cities, some of them are owned. especially in Pune. Other places may not be. So we have to really think through it. But I completely agree that the human element cannot be forgotten. And so this roster that Mark talked about, or creating a few hubs, is something that we will have to think through. We are also going to have to, because we are in capital goods, Ajit. And, order carry forward in capital goods is the most important thing. And so, to be honest, we have a great order carry forward coming into this year, into this financial year. But what happens next year? What happens the year after? Especially if consumption patterns change. How do we look at it differently? How do we ramp up services? How do we look at digitization? And how digitization can be a catalyst for us, or an enabler, huge enabler for us. So these are some of the things that we're really thinking about.
Yeah,
great.
You know,
so let me ask. Sorry, you wanted to say something, Mark? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going to pick up on the. Some of this is going to be consumer driven, particularly in the fast-moving consumer goods area. I think we won't have a choice about reverting to the past, because consumers are already driving a different set of behaviors through, contactless transactions. And so even in my industry, in agriculture, we're seeing the emergence of a different way of buying, and a movement which is pleasing back towards buying more local. But the consumers are driving a lot of that change, and we have to be in a position to respond. Absolutely.
And sorry, Ajit and Mark, being in capital goods, we are a derived demand.
Yeah.
So it's all to do with what consumers demand.
Yeah. So both of you have throughout this whole session talked about things like uncertainty, talks about things like using technology, empathy, etc., etc. So when you start, whenever, soon, hopefully, when you start recruiting new people, are there new qualities you look for in them?
I'll jump in here because, as I said, I've been a student of leadership for a very long time. And one framework that I think has been relevant and continues to be relevant is the one that was developed by Daniel Goleman about social and emotional intelligence. And to me, when I look at all the writings, and there are so many about leadership qualities, they seem to come back to these four fundamentals that Goleman researched, that basically had nothing to do with IQ and a lot to do with emotional intelligence. And they sort of go to the core of, and I must say, Mayor, you display this exceedingly well, but they go to the core of self-awareness, which is really understanding what's going on with yourself. And I trolled through a lot of the writings, particularly McKinsey, about what leadership needs right now. And a lot of it had to do with knowing yourself and knowing, being able to understand what's going on with yourself. The second thing he said was, if you understand yourself, you also have to be able to manage yourself, which is about self-control and calmness in the face of a crisis. So those are what he referred to as the inner radar. And then the outer radar were the two things that we've talked about quite a bit. The capacity for empathy, so understanding what's going on with others, and then the capacity to translate that into ways of communicating all of those things to the people you work with. And so, if you look at the themes that go through everything that's being written, they tend to fall into self-control, self-awareness, self-control or calm management, empathetic understanding, and the capacity to lead others in uncertainty. So I always like to fall back to that framework, but through a different and new lens.
Okay, I think we are already an hour into this thing. I want to very quickly move into the whole issue of NGOs and NGOs management, and again, Meher kind of referred to this. We saw a large number of people spontaneously rising to the occasion, NGOs rising to the occasion to feed people, etc., etc. What has been your experience in Australia, Mark, in the light of these crises? And what changes have you seen in the way in which NGOs themselves have operated?
Yeah, look, the most, I'm just looking to reference it, but the most striking example of this in Australia, and I must say I can't think of a huge number of examples, but this is really a great one. Just out of nowhere, it appears that 20 social enterprises joined forces to create a new food system for delivering food to people in need. And it's quite a remarkable, it happened very, very fast. This thing, which is now started as a project, which I believe now will become a sustainable business, is really moving through the three stages that we've been talking about of relief, recovery, and what they call rejuvenation. So it involves farms, it involves distributors, it involves all sorts of people coming together in kind of the way that seems to have happened in India with migrant workers, in providing food to those in need, but in a very collaborative and coordinated way. And the people who have come together are not all from the food industry. So it's included other social enterprises. It's called Moving Feast. And I think it's a remarkable demonstration of nothing that came from government, nothing that came from anywhere other than one of the social enterprise leaders got this idea and made it happen really fast. It's a lovely example.
Okay. So Meher, you talked about companies changing, corporates trying to look at life differently, adapting to a new world, etc. What about NGOs? Will they also need to change the way they operate?
I think, first of all, I think NGOs have never before have I seen so much collaboration. Very often NGOs are in some ways competing for money, but I think in this case, in a crisis situation, I've just found NGOs coming together, trying to see how best. So it's NGOs coming together, NGOs with corporates, police force, municipal corporations. I mean, it's all permutations and combinations, So I think, I hope we can continue to collaborate going forward. I think that would be really helpful. And I think another thing I think is, which I've seen in this crisis, is huge amount of adaptability. So in our own SVP, I mean, I've seen with, say, Anubhuti, they had certain seamstresses which they were teaching tailoring to. They've immediately moved to making masks.
Yeah.
So in some ways, it's a combination of lives and livelihoods.
Correct.
Together.
Yes.
Yes. And this is done outside Pune. So
Yes.
So these women get to have some amount of money coming into them, and they're serving a purpose.
Yes. Yes. Craftisans did that too. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's so many people who've done huge. So I think one is, I hope collaboration continues. I hope adaptability. Akanksha, for example, they're mainly into education. But what they have found, as I mentioned earlier, in this crisis situation, is that there is a lot of child abuse, and it's very difficult to talk about it. I mean, who do you talk to? So how do we pick up these small triggers? So they've come up, in fact, one of our ex-Akanksha students is on the board of Akanksha. And she came out with a fabulous idea. She said that we've got so many helper didis who work in the slums, who live in the slums. Why don't we train them to pick up these little nuances, you know, and to try and help? So suddenly you're seeing an adaptable situation where an education NGO is moving to how can we help in the community? So I think collaboration and adaptability are two things that I've seen today, and I hope will always continue.
And should that then be one of our core contributions to encourage more, as SVP I'm talking about,
I think so.
that, you know, we also need to rethink, just like we are telling others, the rest of the world to rethink. Should we also not rethink and say, look, our core should be to create these great agglomerations? Again, it fits in with Arun's, the whole systems approach. So that's
Yeah. Unfortunately, I missed Arun's talk, but yeah, it's absolutely part of the systems approach. Absolutely. I totally agree.
Another question, and sorry, Mark, this is much more for Meher, but you know, we talked of livelihoods, and for the most part, our effort on livelihood was in urban cities, which then meant migration, etc., etc. So as SVP, do you think we should really now ourselves step back and say, should we be looking at rural livelihood creation where people are, rather than, you know, have people move? And of course, then that has another implication to our own companies and industries which are based and dependent on those migrant workers. How do we find, I mean, what kind of thinking should we as SVP be going through to look at these issues?
I mean, I don't have answers.
No.
But I think some of the areas that we probably need to discuss is that, and I don't know whether it is pure livelihoods that we should be looking at going forward. I mean, I have a question mark in my mind for SVP. Should it be pure livelihoods, or should we push the envelope and look at entrepreneurship? You know, because I don't know how many jobs there will be out there. People are talking about reducing jobs. People are talking about automation. And so therefore, I just feel that maybe we need to think through, should we also be talking about entrepreneurship, you know, and looking at, I don't know, but maybe like a De Astra model that Anand has done extremely well, or some different models. I don't know. We'll have to
Ravi Venkatesan, who started SVP, is doing GAME,
right,
which is about mass entrepreneurship.
Exactly.
And mass entrepreneurship everywhere in the country.
Absolutely.
And those models will probably come up.
So that's one thing. Second, Rati brought up a great idea, which is that for Pune, and where maybe we could have corporates who are, I mean, I know that Bangalore and other people have done it, but this is the first time for Pune. Can we have corporates who are SVP members? And those corporates need not be in the city. There are some corporates who have their manufacturing locations outside cities, some in rural areas. So if they become members, then somehow through SVP, can we get them and their people involved in doing activities outside cities? Okay. You know, I think these are things that we need to discuss much more, but these are just some thoughts.
Good, but I think just like we are telling others to think, it's good that we ourselves are thinking about it, right? We've got 15 minutes left. I'm going to lob this back to Ganesh for people's questions rather than my continuing with many more. Ganesh, would you take over?
Absolutely. There were some very interesting questions. And maybe Ajit, you should also participate in answering some of those with your wisdom. And, one, I mean, actually, it's a combined question. It starts with Vineet asking that, look, can we talk a little bit about descaling of businesses, which may be necessary in this economy? It kind of comes to, I think, what Rohan Iyer is saying from SVP Bombay Partner, saying, how do we drive a sense of calm, even while there is some panic going on around us? And finally, what Piyush is saying, which is, there is going to be some firing, there are going to be some furloughs, there are going to be salary cuts. So as leaders, how do we deal with the negative side of any pandemic or any catastrophe. Any thoughts on that?
Ganesh.
So yeah,
Sorry.
go on.
Where are you? There you are. I think yes, there will be many people. There have been already many people losing jobs. But I think as corporate leaders, I think it's important to do it in a humane manner, to be empathetic, to try and see ways in which we can help them, possibly, I don't know, do something else, put them in touch with search firms. I mean, I think the most important thing is to do it in a humane manner. I mean, it's an oxymoron because the fact that you're just losing your job is itself inhumane in that sense. But I think if you can do it with some humanity part of it, I think that would be what I would say.
Any thoughts, Mark, on that?
Yeah, look, I think taking it that next step, as Maya said, and really genuinely helping people through transition. And that may be a much more extended process where you can work with people to help them understand their skills and what the opportunities are, and really help them find alternatives. And for me, the focus is on employability as opposed to employment. And that arguably that process should have started, should be ongoing in organizations to reskill people, because while we've got this crisis, then there are going to be waves of automation and AI that are going to consume a lot of jobs. So whether it's caused by economic downturn now or change in the shape that organizations operate, we are going to have to do that on a continuous basis. To my mind, the organizations with the best reputations are those that, as Maya says, deal with people in a transparent, fair, and helpful way, so that they leave the organization saying, I'm sorry it happened, but I was given a lot of help.
An interesting question from Meenakshi, who's from the Harvard Business School Research Center in Mumbai. So our question is, how do you deal with divergence and convergence? In the sense that you will get a lot of divergent views in terms of every action that leadership or the management team has to take in this crisis. But again, as a leader, you have to drive some sense of convergence so that the show can go on and we can move forward. So any thoughts on at what stage do you pull the trigger and say, guys, let's choose one path. There are multiple ways to do this. Nobody has traversed this path before, but how do we go forward? Any thoughts on that?
Ganesh, it's a great question. I would say that there are some non-negotiables probably that need to be put on the table. It's almost like creating a template. And then everything outside that is for people to take up and run with. So, for example, the way we've thought through it in terms of, at the moment, we will look at salary cuts, not get rid of people. At the moment, we will not invest other than these 3 areas. So people in some ways get to know that this is what is okay to do. Anything that's not in there, please go ahead and do what you think is right for the customer, do what you think is right for our suppliers, for our channel partners. Go ahead and do it. So I think that's the way I would look at it.
You're saying extreme focus will bring everybody to a point of view.
To some focus areas, but not making it crushingly difficult,
Sure.
I think defining what you're really doing is you're defining your core values and the core principles, that these are non-negotiable. You're also defining de facto outside it, that after that customer satisfaction is still rampant, all these are important. Now you have the freedom.
Yeah.
You cannot sacrifice people for this. And I think, Ram Kondine also asked a very interesting question, which is linked to that is, when doing that, are you willing to sacrifice short-term profitability for long-term sustainability?
Yeah. I mean, we're really looking to see, in those 5 scenarios that we've done, and we've come down to this realistic and the worst case scenario. We're looking to see how do we at least maintain cash break even. It's not easy to build a balance sheet, Ajit. And ultimately, as my mom said in 2000, she said that if somebody said, chop your right hand, you'd say, don't be stupid. Why would I chop my right hand? I'm perfectly healthy. But if gangrene sets in and it's a question of my survival, then I will have to cut my right hand in order for the enterprise to survive. So I think short-term profit certainly, but one has to look at the enterprise.
So good. So you have defined it already. That look, this thing is, it has to be a cash break even. And I think that's, so there you are. I mean, and I'm willing to sacrifice profits above that, but I'm not willing to go into a loss. And I think that clarity is huge, huge. Another colleague of mine, and this again could come up, people wonder, okay, you've got a balance sheet, you've got reserves, why aren't you using it now? And the reason we are not using it now is because we don't know what's going to be required in future.
Absolutely.
So another thing that needs to really come out, but I think what you're doing, which is really setting that framework. So these I can live with, these I will not accept. I think will go a long way in helping. And again, it goes back to transparency, to being open, to being clear with people, etc. Great.
There's a related question. I mean, actually, related issue that I wanted to touch upon. I mean, I think talked over the last hour very much on work from home. And in fact, if you look at the industry I come from, which is the technology industry, there's a perception that out of the 4.2 million people who work here, potentially 90% could continue to work from home in the long term. I'm one of the people who are anti that, because I'm saying that, look, if let's say 4 million people start working from home, we're going to lose 12 million jobs in transportation, security, hospitality, so many other areas, restaurants, bars. So we have to think about that. But the question that I think Savita is making an interesting point, saying that when you want to continue to work from home, can we get women to come to the office and the men to stay at home? She said that might be an idea.
That will be disastrous in the house.
See, this is the typical perception against men. But the important question is Sanjeev Sachars, our Delhi chairs. He's saying, is there going to be a change in leadership with 70% or 50% people working from home? Are we going to be completely asked to revisit whatever we learned in business school and look at our leadership style all over again?
I think
absolutely.
Completely.
Absolutely.
How do you think, Mark? I mean, can you elaborate on that?
Well, I think many, as people have already experienced, managing remotely is a very, very different thing to managing within eyesight. And there's been a lot of stuff written recently about the psychology of working remotely. So, we need to much better understand the human aspects of remote working and how to connect people. And I don't think that we have really delved into that in any significant way. Some organizations have, but I think across the board, no. I think there's a lot of learning to take place there.
Also,
especially in manufacturing, we used to do by, management by walking about, right? How do you relate to people? You talk to people, you meet them, you have lunch with them, you have tea with them. Now all of a sudden, we are doing all of that remotely. And you're right. I mean, many of those things will have to be rethought very, very differently. But I think, we are already getting into a practical, what we call experiential learning in this last 6 weeks. Yeah. Go ahead, Meher.
On the other hand, I've seen that for the first time, when we were talking to our women, the men actually helped them with housework. helped them with the kids, helped them with, because now everything is online in terms of education. So sitting with their children and actually going through their education. So I feel that in some ways, we might have to redefine what does success mean to me as an individual. Is it just money, 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 money? Or is it family, strong bonds? We've been so used to sort of leaving the kids with someone and going to work. I don't know, some things might change in terms of some of the fundamental questions we're asking ourselves.
Okay, one interesting question, I think we'll have to stop with that. But I mean, we're talking about philanthropy. In fact, Sunil Bhandari, who's our newly elected Calcutta co-chair. So Sunil is asking this question saying that in a situation like this, how do you bring about greater individual philanthropy? In fact, this was alluded to by Ruby from Pune as well, where she said that, look, isn't this the time to give more now, which is so important? And Naren mentioned that, is this the time to give till you hurt and not just give what is available? So I think what is your view, Mayor, being one of our significant philanthropists? How do we encourage more philanthropy in these times?
First of all, I'm not very significant. There are many people who are doing much, much more. But I think everybody has been has seen what's out there, and I'm sure everybody is doing something about it, either through giving through money or I'm sure they're doing it the SVP way. I just feel, and I'll just come back to what Ajit asked about SVP. Some of the things sometimes I'm wondering right now is, should SVP also be looking at some kind of advocacy? Because I just feel that there is so much out there, whether it is in our own cities, which we are seeing in terms of health, poor sanitation. There's huge amounts of inequity, huge. How long can that go on? As Anu says, business cannot survive in a society that fails. So in many ways, we need to be responsible and advocate for change. So in terms of giving, I don't know whether it's just the money part of it that we can think about as SVP, but I think, can we be advocates for change? We've seen what's happened with migrant workers. I'm very keen to understand more about it. We've requested Dasra to hold a session for us to help us to understand, because one of their NGO partners has done an excellent report on migrant labor and what all have they gone through. So whoever's interested in SVP, if we can come together, first of all, understand, because it's so far from our daily lives, and then see how we can advocate for change. I think that's really, really important.
I think that's a great note to close on, because as we all know, SVP International has been also engaged in a lot of advocacy, getting thought leaders to come and talk to us on the fundamental issues of equity worldwide. So I think that's something very, very important. Just to close, folks, first of all, before I formally thank everybody, I think please join us. And we thought it was going to be a 4-part series, but there are a lot of popular demand. So it's actually become a 6-part. The next part of the series is when we're going to get 3 really eminent scientists who are going to come in conversation, 9:30 a.m., led by our Bangalore chair, Jogin, who himself is a great scientist in our midst. So please do join us for that. That's 9:30 on Saturday. And then on the 13th of June, we have Amit Chandra, who's again one of our great philanthropists, and a couple of others coming together to talk about scaling of philanthropy, which I'm sure will be of interest to all of you. So let me close, and right at the end, I'll ask Mrinal to put up the screen, which is your response to that quiz question. But before that, let me just say thank you very much, Mark, for joining us from Melbourne. Thank you, Meher, for your wonderful thoughts as always. And thank you, Ajit, for doing an absolutely fabulous job of chairing this. And Mrinal, back to you, and thank you very much. See you on Saturday, folks.
Yes.
Let's just show the... So
is it visible to everybody?
Yes, hopefully.
I hope it is.
So everybody's kind of fence-sitting, saying we've planned for the short and medium term, but I guess that's the best we can do. So thank you very much, folks, and see you on Saturday morning.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you.
Thanks, Ajit. Thanks, Mark.
Great. Thank you. Thanks. Bye. Thanks a lot, Mark.
Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you guys. Great.
Thanks, Manal.